Hi, Kings Mountain. We're back again with updates with the city manager. I'm your city manager, Jim Palaniuk, and we have a kind of a interesting topic today. I think it's something that many people probably won't know that much about, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to cover it, because it's become a little bit of a trending topic, and we thought we should get some information out there and make it clear to people what it is and what it isn't. And specifically, we want to talk about extraterritorial jurisdiction. That's a big word, but basically, a lot of people refer to that as ETJ. So when we talk about this concept of ETJ, or extraterritorial jurisdiction, it's really this buffer or transition area that exists immediately surrounding the urban jurisdiction of a city. And typically in the state of North Carolina, it's been provided that approximately a mile out in all directions from the city's boundaries, you have this area called extraterritorial jurisdiction. What was unusual for the city of Kings Mountain is for quite a long time, actually going back decades, the city had been granted 2 miles in this area beyond its boundaries. It was kind of unusual. Don't really know why it first existed, but it did. So for the last several decades, we had this area of our extraterritorial jurisdiction that extended out 2 miles from the existing city boundaries. More recently, here in 2024, with this last legislative session, there was a change to that. The state legislature wrote a new bill that basically removed half or 1 mile of that extraterritorial jurisdiction from the city. So where we used to have land use planning control or regulation extending out 2 miles beyond the city boundary, we then were, as of October of this year, limited to back to 1 mile. But what is more interesting, and we're going to show you on a map in just a second here, is the decision-making that goes into what seemed like a fairly simple act of the state legislature. One would assume that the state legislature said, okay, you used to be 2 miles, now it's going to be 1 mile. So you get your GPS out and you determine on a map exactly 1 mile surrounding all the borders around your community, and you create a new map, a new border. But what happens when you do that is that invariably there's lots of different parcels of land, lots of different owners of those parcels of land. And when you go to 1 mile, what's going to happen is you are going to, in many, many cases, somehow cut a boundary of a property somewhere into parts. It might be 50-50, it might be 30-70, it might be 20-80, it might be anything along the continuum. But the point of that is, it's almost certainly not going to fall directly on somebody's property boundary when you extend it out the 1 mile. So a decision has to be made then. Do you extend the boundary slightly beyond the 1 mile to keep the entire parcel in, or do you actually contract the boundary in from the 1 mile to give the parcel jurisdiction back to, in this case, the county rather than the city? Let's step back a second, too, to talk about what does ETJ really mean, because we say land use regulation. Understand what ETJ is not. It does not give people who live in that area the ability to vote for anything in the city. They are not required to pay any sort of taxes to the city. They are not involved in the city in any way like that. It simply means that when it comes to decisions about land use planning and zoning, things of that nature, the city still has the ability to control that, because when you think about it, it makes a good deal of sense. This was a strategic way that the state looked at it that should be protected. So you want to protect the property. So if you're very urban, leading out to the edge of your community, and say there's a well-developed subdivision, or it's intense residential, maybe it's commercial, maybe it's some combination, and then all of a sudden you stop that jurisdiction, and a different entity, call it a county in this case, might have entirely different regulations, and maybe it's zoned very different. Suddenly you have the prospect that you could have a junkyard immediately adjacent to a nice single-family housing residential, or you might have a swine farm next to residential, or you might have any combination that if somebody really had the ability to think strategically, wouldn't really want it that way because it wouldn't be protecting the property values or the sensibilities or the ability of either of those kinds of properties. So it makes sense then to allow some amount of regulatory effect by the city as it transitions away from a more urban center to less and less urban to more rural, and that buffer zone, so that's that ETJ buffer zone. So that's what an ETJ does. That's what it allows a city to do. And let's take a quick look then at kind of the map that's been created as a result of these changes from the state and how that is impacting some of the decision making here locally. Okay, so in a way to try to illustrate this, we've prepared a map. This isn't entirely simple, but we're going to try to simplify it to the best that we can, and we've kind of done this basically through colors and through lines. So imagine what you're looking at basically is essentially the city of Kings Mountain, and the best way to look at this is everything in gray, that is the jurisdiction of the city of Kings Mountain. So these sharp black lines surround the city of Kings Mountain. That is actual city of Kings Mountain jurisdiction. Now, the areas beyond this are all in some way part of either that original or now new and or proposed amended extraterritorial jurisdiction. So originally, everything beyond this gray area, so that what you have is kind of a mauve or a purple and some crosshatch and some blue areas, all of this was included in the original extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city. And that's been in place now for several decades. Very little concern, very little controversy. It's been out there for quite a long time. More recently, October of this year, 1924, or well, 19, I'm a little off here, 2024, the state legislature produced a bill that said, okay, your extraterritorial jurisdiction is now 1 mile beyond your boundaries. So, see this heavy black line. This is essentially, as determined by GPS now, in Cleveland County, beyond the borders of the city of Kings Mountain, the new extraterritorial jurisdictional boundary for the city of Kings Mountain. But as we talked about a little earlier, when you do that, you cut through a lot of different properties. So you can't just simply go by this line. So what then did the city do as a result of that? We looked at it from a planning perspective, and we included some of the properties in some cases where it was consistent to keep a full property boundary in one jurisdiction or another, extending a little bit beyond the line, or in some cases coming a little bit in from the line. So these crosshatch areas that go out in odd areas, that was our original boundary that said in some cases we need to have this extend a little bit. In one case it comes in a little bit. And then you kind of see the same thing happen around there. But then in turn, Cleveland County came back and said, well, we would like to see all of these areas indicated by yellow crosshatching, all well within the 1 mile barrier, actually amended now to come out of your ETJ, to actually then become part of the county's jurisdiction. And of course, there are some real significant problems with that in many cases. And some of those cases would be, for instance, this entire mica mine property that is immediately adjacent to the city's planned entertainment and hospitality district, that suddenly the city would have no ability to regulate land use on. That would be a big concern because of the nature of how important it is to what it's next to. You also have Dixon Ridge, the big master plan development that the city already has a development agreement on, somehow being proposed that goes away from the ETJ. That can't happen. It's already been agreed to be annexed. It's already subject to a development agreement. You've got a portion of the entertainment district itself called Catawba Village South, which somehow now is being proposed to come in and not be included, which again can't happen, needs to be part of a development agreement. You have a large property up here that is not only completely contained within the 1 mile boundary, but it's barely a few hundred yards from the city's actual jurisdictional boundary. So it makes no sense whatsoever that all this distance in somehow you're now going to give this back. That doesn't make sense. Now, what does make sense, and we're fully amenable to, and again, it's about proper planning, is when you have a fully developed subdivision that falls within, part of one jurisdictional boundary and part of it in another, then you need to agree on saying, hey, who gets this? It either goes city or county, and I think that heads can agree on that, can prevail. We can talk about it, whatever's reasonable, primarily whatever those folks want to be in, because in those cases where you have fully developed subdivisions, the regulations for land use planning, zoning, etc., are almost identical between city and county. So really, whether you're in one or the other, it doesn't really matter. So again, those things can be agreed upon. We have one here, we have one here, we have some over here, relatively easy to work through, and I think that would be easy. We could easily give those up to the county, and I think we've indicated to them that that's not a problem. I think the bigger problem then is there is no good reasoning behind, and it would make no sense to give up land use jurisdiction on some of these critically important pieces that are either immediately adjacent to major development things or that are actually part of those development things. So that becomes the issue. So it's important to know just what an ETJ is, what it isn't, what it does, what it doesn't do. And what we wanted to do more than anything today with this little sort of primer is the idea of to acknowledge the fact that sometimes you can be affected by land use regulations even though you're not technically in one jurisdiction, but you are adjacent to it. So hopefully if you do have questions about that, don't hesitate to get back in touch with us. Let us know. We're more than happy to answer that. And in the meantime, until next time, this has been Updates with the City Manager. Have a great day, Kingsman.